Welcome to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Welcome to this episode of the Counsel Culture podcast. Today we're joined by William Peake, the Global Managing Partner at Harney's. With over 18 years' experience in cross-border litigation and insolvency, William has been instrumental in steering Harney's strategic cultural direction across its global offices. In this conversation, we're exploring culture as capital, how fairness, care, and anti-bullying initiatives drive long-term law firm success. So, William, you've played a key role in shaping your firm's approach to fairness, anti-bullying, and truly supporting your people, not as standalone well-being initiatives, but as something embedded in the business strategy. And that's really at the heart of what we're going to be exploring today. It's not just why creating a positive culture matters, but how it translates into business value, whether that's in retaining top talent, attracting the next generation of lawyers, or strengthening your brand, or even driving business development. It's got a lot of positives aside from the initiative and the way it can look. So William, hello. How are you?
Hi, Olivia. Yeah, really good, thanks. How are you?
I'm great, thank you. It's lovely to have you on the podcast. I think as we always kind of start out, I'd love to hear just, a little bit about yourself and what your role entails.
Sure. Well, there's one thing I love talking about Olivia. It's myself. So that's it's a real easy one. So yeah, as you said, I'm the global managing partner at Harney's, which is an international offshore law firm. And my role as global managing partner is I chair the firm's executive committee, which sets the strategic direction and the cultural agenda of the firm. But my role is very much to provide that cohesion amidst all of the offices, because one of the real challenges is just setting a culture that resonates both in Asia, in Europe, and in the Caribbean. So I spend an awful lot of time on a plane, but I think that it's worth it, because one thing that COVID definitely taught us as a business that there is really no substitute for seeing people and actually spending meaningful time with them. So that's a little bit about me.
Absolutely. And I mean, leading on from that, so what role do you think that law firm leaders play or should play in shaping the day-to-day culture of the firm?
So I think they play a really, really important role. You need to be quite careful that the firm isn't the individual and that the firm is a standalone. And that's something that I'm extremely conscious of, because I think that any office or any firm that just has this kind of cult of the personality, I think that can actually be quite dangerous. Now, I suspect there's an awful lot of people doing a lot of eye rolling, yes, eye rolling to that observation, given how kind of prolific I am on LinkedIn. But a lot of what I'm doing there is I'm talking about things that are really important to our firm, and I take it extremely seriously that my role as managing partner, because you're essentially a CEO and you are setting the tone, you're setting the agenda for what is acceptable and what's not acceptable, and you're empowering people as well to do their jobs. And I think that's really, really important. So I think that law firm leaders need to be vocal on important issues. And I think a lot of law firm leaders are quiet on way too much important stuff. And it's been suggested that I'm a touch, controversial or a bit out there on some of the things that I want to talk about. But I think it's really important that I am, bullying, for example, you said it in the introduction. That's a topic that I spoke about nonstop for 2 weeks, and the reaction to that, I think, said everything you need to know, that that's what people want to hear their leaders talking about.
Exactly. And I mean, I guess in a way, now getting to that level yourself, you've seen the do's and don'ts, seeing previous leaders. So I guess what's a moment in your career where you realised sort of the impact of a law firm sort of managing partner and maybe how you would like to follow in their footsteps, or maybe the exact opposite and thought, I'm definitely never going to do that if I reach that position.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really interesting because a lot of people will say that you learn from good managers, and that's absolutely true. But you can also learn so much from bad managers. And I would say early on in my career that I was in a department that had approach that, the beatings will continue until morale improves. And that was the
Wow.
mindset that I started out my career. I was nervous about raising issues. When I raised issues, I thought they weren't properly addressed or they weren't addressed fairly, or
Mhm.
the dice was always loaded against me. Um, and I also could see, I could recognize that for anybody to knock on the door of a partner with a problem, that weeks and weeks of conversations with their friends, anxiety, angst-ridden thoughts had brought them to that point. So the very moment before they knock on the door, they are taking a huge deep breath because they know they're about to put they're about to be vulnerable, and they're about to say that they have a problem, and the absolute least that the partner on the other side of that door can do is listen and try to help. And I think as well, I recognized quite early in my career that um, sometimes people, when they knock on your door, they actually just want a cathartic rant. And it's really interesting identifying the difference between that. And I see an awful lot of that now. I mean, I have a huge amount of people who just, dump anxiety on me. That's totally fine because that actually is my job. There is nobody better to dump anxiety on than the CEO. And but I always early in my career when people used to give me problems, I used to kind of run off and try to solve them, and that was actually a really bad idea because I would try to run off without seeking their permission to deal with it. And then I would come back into a couple of days and go, "You're welcome. Sort it for you." And they're like, "What are you talking about? I was just unloading.
Yeah, yeah.
I didn't want you to do anything with it." And I was like, "Okay, well, I may have I may have made this situation worse. You're welcome." So you've got to be really, really careful about permissions and that. But at the same time, though, you don't want somebody to think that you are creating this architecture around the problem that's going to make it insurmountable. So you can't say things like, "Well, look, I'm going to have to speak to this person and this person, that person." And the other person's going, "Oh my god, that seems like an awful lot of hard work." You've got to say, "Look, this is how this will play out, and this is where I think we should get to." Um, so that's so I definitely learned an awful lot in my career, and I've learned through you know, I always say that it's only a mistake if you do it twice. So I've learned an awful lot from my many, many, many mistakes.
Exactly. I mean, as you say, that it happens all the way through life, right? You're at the very top of the tree, and it's every day. I'm sure there's still those learning moments for yourself. Yeah. So, in terms of, as you mentioned before, your LinkedIn profile, you talk about a lot of topics on there. You talk about mental health, work-life balance, and you've amassed over 16,000 followers.
No.
So, yeah, congratulations. So what is your advice for leaders that want to start posting more regularly about, you know, mental health, about sort of speaking out and aligning themselves not only on social media but also internally to, not do as I say, not as I do, if you will.
Yeah, I think you need to be. I think social media doesn't work if the person that you are presenting is not at least a somewhat of a reflection of what you are as an individual. Now, I often do a technique of an echo comment from my school WhatsApp group of them slagging me off basically because obviously I'm presenting a very polished version of me. Of course, I am extremely different around my good friends and how I am in the workplace. And I think that, but I am going to talk about the things that are important to me. And I am going to say things like, uh, if I don't exercise, my mental health will take a dip. If I drink too much, I will be riddled with anxiety the next day. If I don't eat properly, I will become anxious. And the reason I'm talking about that is because I have to make so many decisions every single day. And I'm really conscious that the decisions I make impact people in a very profound and real way. And the very least I can do is be the best version of myself when I'm making those decisions. And the and I think for people to hear their leader talk about things like that, I think it's really, really important. And but there is a credibility gap if the person that you're presenting isn't the person that somebody meets in round the office. And I've so many examples in the past of people judging me in the office based on how I dress, because I absolutely love clothes. And I but I because I'm all in the mornings, I'm always like in my running gear and my gym gear. And I remember having a scenario about 4 or 5 years ago, and or maybe it was longer than it was, so six years ago, and I just made it to being an equity partner in the business. And in law firms, that is a big step up when you become an equity partner. And I think a lot of people are expecting you to change quite dramatically. And I was in the kitchen in the London office, and a partner was visiting from one of our other offices, and they're no longer with us, not directly related to this incident, but they, I was in the kitchen and I said hello to them, and because I was in my like, you know, running gear, they just ignored me and they just assumed that I worked in the post room. And then, later that day, so I have two settings in work. Either it looks like the bike courier is working in the litigation department, or extremely formal. And I was dressed in that afternoon in like a three-piece suit and a shirt and tie. And then they came in and they're like, "Oh my God, William, it's so nice to meet you," because they thought, they were like, "I've got to meet this guy because he's just made equity and he could have a significant influence on my future career in the business." And I was like, "Well, actually, I met you earlier in the kitchen." And they were like, "Really?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was the guy who said hello to
Oh,
you." And I was like,
wow.
"Yeah, no," and it's just, and I find all that really, really interesting, because
Yeah,
I think I think lawyers are so susceptible to kind of how they're perceived, how they look, what watch they're wearing, etc., that you can get lost a lot in the noise. And again, I go back to that point that I think if more law firm leaders talked about things like mental health and anti-bullying, that it would go an awful long way.
absolutely. And as you said, it's easy to get bogged down in that
Yeah.
stuff. I mean, I think we've all been guilty of it at one point or another. You move up in life and you think you're great, but to come down with a bit of a thud, as you just said with one of your former colleagues there, hopefully there's a lesson learned for him or her, as well. Um, Now, moving on a little bit here, I wondered if you'd seen this story in the press recently about CEOs that are now sending AI avatars to meetings, to town halls. So recently, the CEO of Klarna and Zoom have both sent their AI
Yeah.
doubles to deliver sort of earnings calls or, what have you. How do you feel? I can already tell, I think, what the response is going to be to this.
Yeah.
But how do you
I,
feel about that? And what's your
I,
opinion of that, I suppose?
I think it's terrible, and I think that it's such a lack of authenticity. And I Isabel Berrick, who writes for the FT, very kindly featured me in an article of hers recently, and it was all about producing video content because it's authentic, and I get a lot of my stuff I just produce on the fly. And but because people can see me and hear me, I think that produces a kind of a bond between the viewer and me in a way that it's quite, I think it's trickier to do with the written word. And the reason is the written word can be curated very easily. And, if I went into, anybody in Byfield, for example, could produce a campaign for me to make me, the most superbly empathetic, phenomenal leader whatsoever. But then if somebody meets me and they go, okay, well, there's a total disconnect here between what has been curated and presented as you, and what the actual reality is. And that's why, again, in LinkedIn, the real magic happens in the comments, because
Mhm.
that's when people can actually see and understand the voice of the person and what's really important to them. And I just don't understand why you would send an avatar to do that to do that role. And I'm sure there are really, really good reasons that I don't recognize, but I don't see it. And also, what's really interesting about leadership is that people want to see their leaders, their managers, their partners looking a bit uncomfortable sometimes. They want to see that this matters to them. They want to see that actually this has impacted them. And I also think it, again, looking out through the other end of the telescope, it gives the leader the opportunity to go, look how fleet-footed I am. Look at my agility of thought. Look at how I can thread the eye of a needle here on making a really, really big point in a really discreet way. And I'm doing that responding to your question. And I think that gives people an awful lot of faith in their leadership to be able to see that. But people love, I mean, I've done many's a call in my role where like all staff calls where, tricky issues have been raised. And people, I think people really enjoy looking at me fumbling for an answer, because they're like, he's not making it up. He doesn't actually have the answer. And that goes an awful long way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, just to look back to sort of, the piece that was you were featured in the FT recently, and sort of which was about your online presence. And you spoke a bit about it there in terms of the human element, and people want to see you. It's easy, as you say, to write something, but people want to see what you have to say. They want to hear your voice. They want to hear you maybe stutter a little bit if you can't quite get your thoughts out. So what kind of content resonates most with your audience on LinkedIn?
Like really brief content. So I think what resonates most is when I'm talking about things like mental health. The anti-bullying thing was really, really blew up, and I had millions of views for that in the space of a couple of weeks. But interestingly, when I talk about like I did a video today about the challenges of moving from being a salary partner into being an equity partner. And when I deal with those really bespoke topics, you can see that the traction it gets is with exactly that group. And I've received 20, 30 messages today about that video, about how helpful they find it and how nobody in their business talks about those things. Um, and when I talk, and I think when I when I give people hope, when I give people a sense of, if you stay on a good path, if you focus on things like business development, financial discipline, just being a good citizen, that you will be able to plow a furrow in a career in law. And I think it does give people a lot of hope, because they think, well, if I didn't go to the right school and I didn't go to the right university and I didn't do the right internship, and I talk a lot about, for me, the best education I ever had was working, as a maitre d' in a flash restaurant in Chicago, because it taught me how to manage people's expectations. It taught me how to communicate really, really clearly, and it taught me how to build a rapport with people instantly. And they were all partner 101 skills.
Yeah.
And always the challenge has always been in my career that I knew I was really, really good with people from an early age because my mum is genuinely one of the most personable people you can imagine. She worked in fashion. She had an ability to build an instant rapport, and so I was always good at that bit. The bit that I struggled more with was the actual black letter lawyering. I mean, I was smart, but I was like, 7 out of 10 smart. I wasn't 11 out of 10 smart, and that was the bit that I had to play a lot of catch up with. And I think when I talk about things like that, I think it really resonates with people because they're like, oh, I fall into that category. And I'm also really honest about uh, law is really, really difficult and it's really demanding and it's a very high stress, high octane environment. And there will be times when you will think, I'm not going to get through this. But that's when you think about the last time you thought that and you did get through it. And that is what resilience is in a nutshell. It's remembering that you've got through things before.
And I think that's a great sort of way of framing it, for other people that are listening to you that maybe aren't, at that level, or they're still, maybe trying to get there, and to keep that, your morale up,
Yeah.
and to keep being productive and motivated, which it all sounds very easy, but when you're in the thick of it, it's not. So, I mean, in terms of where you're at now, how has investing in the culture of Harney's sort of produced more productivity or team performance, or even bettered client relationships? Do you have any examples?
Yeah, I think I do have examples in terms of we are the best example I can give you is that the talent that we are attracting now is so much different to what we attracted 4 years ago. And I am a one person recruitment agency because I get all of the CVs come through to me
Okay.
and I have access to all of the big onshore law firms because I've built relationships with them over the last few years. So I think that's a really good example of it because our culture is starting to resonate with people. Now, make no mistake, when you boil it all down, we're still a law firm and we still, you know, charge high hourly rates and we charge because we're good at what we do. But the message around, I think when you charge the hourly rates of the big firm, you absolutely should know the answer to the question. And I think clients, that's the least that clients can expect. But what they can't expect is that you're going to be thoroughly pleasant and enjoyable to work with, and that you're somebody who you don't mind ringing at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night because you're in a bind. And that's the real difference. And the other piece that I would say around culture, etc., is that we've always had a really, really good culture at Harney's. So the fact I talk about it more than previous people in my position did, that doesn't mean it's a better culture at all. Because we're 65 years old this year, and you don't get to that level without having a good culture all the way through. So I'm very much standing on the shoulders of previous giants, and I think that when you try to, I think the things that I want to talk about, the things that are important to me, what has interested me is it always takes longer than you think because I am a really ener- high energy slash massively annoying individual. I always think high energy means you are annoying. Very annoying. Got really good energy, but so it does take longer. But what happens is you reach a tipping point, and that's really fascinating when you get there and you suddenly identify and you see things suddenly start to become easier because you see things don't end up on your desk as much because people know what the standard is and what's going to be acceptable and what isn't. So that's been really nice to see. And I'm 2.5 years into the role, and it feels now as if I can start to identify that it's moving in the direction that I'm really, really pleased with.
No, absolutely. And I mean, for associates, etc., they'll view you as, I imagine you're very sort of accessible and easy to approach.
High
However,
energy.
there's high energy, exactly, not high energy. Um, but I'm sure that obviously, there's people below you that a complaint or the links would go to first. So
Yeah.
what role do middle managers play in sort of upholding or undermining a positive workforce?
Yeah, such an important role. And it's really interesting as well that I have to arrest myself from stepping over other people because you erode the trust and confidence that anybody will have with the person sitting in the management rung below you. If you, with the stroke of a pen, flex and say, this is what must happen. Now, I will always speak to all of the kind of senior managers in the business, and I'll always help them chart a path through an issue. But it's very, very important actually that I'm not seen as the puppeteer moving things. And I think that that kind of middle management role is really, really challenging. And I think as well, it exposed, the real challenge between all the management structures is the intergenerational issue now. And that is I see it as a language barrier, actually. So people talk a lot about, people have different priorities, etc. And, they want this work-life balance, etc., etc. And I think that's a really reductive and unfair way of looking at it. And I think it does a disservice to younger generations. And I think there's so much more to it. And I think you have to think about things like the cost of living. How is that impacting somebody? You have to think about the opportunities that exist now. You have to think about younger generations are considering AI an opportunity, but an existential threat as well. So I really don't think it's as straightforward as that. And I think way too many people of my vintage don't think enough about that. And they don't, and also look, I sometimes trick myself into thinking that, I'm down with the kids because like my niece is 19 and good fun and talks to me and I wear sneakers and I dress like a teenager, but there's a lot more, just there's an awful lot more to it than that. And we're only, as a business, we're only going to get to the right place by properly listening to people and not being dismissive of what's important and what isn't. And I think as well, going kind of full circle to the point I made around the ability to see people in person. I think so much is done behind video screens now, and I find, I'm recording this from Frankfurt, and so I'm on video calls all day, and I know I'm going to be absolutely busted at the end of. I find video calls back to back really, really exhausting, but I'm on them all the time. But I do in a way that when I'm in London and I'm doing people meetings, it's energy because there's a kinetic energy in the room.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I think in terms of sort of how you can communicate best with the people that are in your team or closest to you, and even then how it's going to trickle down. How can you communicate sort of the behaviors that you want from people and the way that you want people to act within the firm? And what have you learned about sort of trying to communicate that in your experience?
Well, I think it's all about setting the standard and things like what like behavior. For example, like, I believe a partner in a law firm is a really, really difficult role, and I never underestimate that. And I think, but it's a real privilege because you have an opportunity to influence change in a way that you probably don't sitting outside of that kind of partnership group. And I do try to set a good example. For example, I very, if ever, have a drink at a work event. And, I'm very careful around my language that I use with people. And Also, I'm really, because I am uh, instinctively quite a flippant, self-deprecating individual. And I think when I took over this role, that was actually a really, really big change for me because I was being flippant about things, and I could see that the person was like, "Oh, this doesn't matter to him," and it did matter to me. It's just that's how I process things, and that was actually a really, really big change for me. That I realized people were uh, taking what I was saying extremely seriously, and I've always been really careful around communications, but that was a real eye opener for me. And I spent forever trying to get the tone and content right on emails, and because I know that people parse and pour over the language now in a way they didn't before. But I do think a lot of leaders overthink it. Just set a good example and don't don't be do as I say, don't do as I do. And I think there's a lot of trappings to as you move up and become more senior, and you've got to identify who's being nice to you because they believe it'll propel their career, and who's being nice to you because they believe that they are enjoying this exchange. And when I was a junior lawyer, I was an obsequious sycophant anytime I had a partner in front of me. I was a disgusting individual. And it's shameful now thinking about how oleaginous I actually was. But but I am quite good at, and I think that's an Irish thing. I think you're quite good at identifying who's actually being genuine and who isn't. And there's and also identifying people who, because I think it was a surprise to people when the firm voted me in as global managing partner because um I was I'm relatively young to be doing a role like this, and I did have slightly unorthodox thinking around some topics that I wanted to talk about. But I think it's the ultimate accolade to the partnership that they identified that they knew I wanted to do it. They knew I would have a lot of enthusiasm and energy for the role, and they voted me in as a result of that. And again, I think it allowed people to see that you don't need to be a certain kind of boil in the bag individual to fulfill a role like this.
Well, exactly. And I think, as you say, that if you enjoy your job, you're probably going to do better at it. And if there's someone there that you know that you, as you say, you trust to lead and that you believe in what they're saying and the direction that they're going to take the firm, you're quite happy to be there and work that extra and go that extra mile. Well, personally,
Yeah.
that's what I think. And the droll of everyday life, if there's a faceless person at the top that no one really knows and they kind of maybe just send out emails or whatever, it's hard to keep going sometimes. So I think that it really makes a difference. And in terms of more on the sort of business side of things, how has a strong culture helped with employee attraction or retention? Or even, I don't know if you will have probably seen it on the client side as well in terms of attraction or retention.
Definitely. I mean, it's definitely helped retain and attract people. And we are in conversations with people from firms that I think previously, because we were less vocal about how good our culture was, we didn't attract them. But the thing, like the reality is that offshore law firms, they have their time in the sun, and they have their time in the shadows. And we're in the sun at the moment. Will that last forever? Absolutely not. And so we've got to kind of make hay now. And opening up in Jersey was a really big deal for us. And I felt a real I felt a real pride to see that post go out and just have three women, setting up that office. And Nicola Roberts has just been a revelation as the managing partner, and somebody who I've learned a huge amount from, because Nicola's been a partner for a longer amount of time than I have. And I'm really acutely aware of there's so many things I don't know, and there's so many things I don't understand. And having somebody like Nicola at the helm there has been wonderful. And I think that the culture of the firm has allowed us to explore that jurisdiction, because opening up a new office is a big deal for any firm. It's a
Oh,
huge
yeah.
cash drain on the
Mhm.
business. It's a huge senior management bandwidth drain. And so it's a really tangible representation of culture, allowing us to do those things.
Mm.
But we've also revitalized a lot of offices. Luxembourg has been a really great office for us in the last 12 months. We made a great hire there with Michael O'Connor, who's complemented Vanessa and Charles on the ground really well. Bermuda as well. We've got a couple of great partners in there, Mary Ward, Henry Tucker, and these are offices that we've just completely revitalized. And when I go to these jurisdictions and when people are falling over themselves to tell me you've got the right people in the right places, that's wonderful. And our Hong Kong office won the HR Asia Award recently, and I was chatting to the managing partner Paul Sefton about that, and he's like, you know, that's Coca-Cola are in that, and we're winning it. And I was like, oh, that's. And he's like, don't do a Coca-Cola joke, and I was like, oh. but these are really
Uh-huh.
these are real feathers in our cap, and we are looking at other jurisdictions, and it's one of the worst kept secrets that we're spending a lot of time exploring the Middle East. And I think that's the exciting bit about being a standalone law firm, because we sold our fiduciary business a couple of years ago, and now we're making sure that we're in all the relevant jurisdictions. So yeah, so it's working out quite well.
And I guess with all of these different jurisdictions comes cultural differences, right? So how do you deal with those nuances in your position?
So we talk a lot amongst the managing partners of each office, and we have a set. We've got our principles, and look, every firm they can plaster their websites with core values, and you can pay consultants to come up with these dreamy words and spend forever working out whether, does that adjective really demonstrate and hold us as a business? Like, just be kind and be considerate, and just
Uh-huh.
don't be difficult to work with. There's your core values. Give people the benefit of the doubt. Treat your colleagues with respect and kindness and compassion, and observe. That's the bit that and I think this is one of the real challenges as well of video calls, is if I am in an office environment, and I can detect if somebody, say there's a guy who's always impeccably dressed, and I start noticing that he's a little less clean shaven, or he's starting to look a little bit more unkempt. What is that telling me? Is that telling me that he's got some challenges? Is he overworked? Is he stressed, etc.? And so you can observe those things. Whereas I think that when you are within the kind of rectangle or square of a Zoom screen, you can conceal an awful lot of um, an awful lot of mess, literally in my case, because my office is absolute den of iniquity. But I think it's really fascinating that we're doing this call, and I can
Yeah.
see a lovely painting behind you, and two plants. But outside of that, it
This
could
is
just
the
be total.
office, to be fair. This
Yeah.
is
Okay. Well, that's even, yeah. That's like, this is, I'm my host, so you're seeing some nice books, etc. and all this kind of stuff.
yeah.
But like, you're not seeing like just a load of like cricket bats, golf balls, BMX that nobody else in the house will take in their room, and just crap everywhere.
Tell me most
So you're
about
able
this. A
Yeah,
few,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that, yeah,
It was like a
actually.
personal reminder, must clean room, right? Yeah.
Yeah, let's just say I didn't really get right. I managed to carve out a path from the door to my chair, which is quite good. But it's just full of random detritus, and
Yeah.
but I often think that that's one of the challenges around remote working and in office working. So culture culture is really really hard to define, but a good culture, you know it when you see it, and you know it when you feel it. And I think that our managing partners across the board do a really good job of that. Now, are we perfect? No, no, we're not. Like, we're absolutely not. We're striving for that, but there are always going to be bubbles in the paint that just need to be addressed. There are always going to be people who present challenges in any business. And I think if I was to sit, if somebody from Harney's was to sit and listen to this and hear me saying it's perfect, I think they would be entitled to say that's just not true. And William knows that. He knows that there are certain things that need to be addressed. Um, and again, I speak really candidly about stuff like that in work, and I think that gives people a real reassurance, because like I am really really conscious that I am a good talker, and I'm really conscious that I can be quite compelling and persuasive around anything that I choose to be. But with that comes a real responsibility to not lose the run of myself, and actually remember that there are real life consequences there. And I actually talk about this. I think about it probably more than I talk about it, but I think toxic positivity is
Mm.
is something that people do not spend anywhere near enough time thinking about. So I have to always resist kind of falling into that trap.
Which I appreciate could be kind of easy, especially if you want to keep people's morale up, etc. But I think honesty is appreciated, and keeps you very much on the ground.
Yeah,
And you know what's going on, and I know this isn't working, for example, and this is how I'm going to fix it.
totally. It's
Yeah,
utterly it's utterly disingenuous, and it's a complete credibility dilution on the individual saying it. And I always think toxic positivity is the equivalent of sugary drink that, you feel great after a can of Coke, you're like, oh, I've got a bit of energy here. After another can of Coke, you're like, probably should stop drinking Coke. And then you have a third can of Coke, and then you just feel squeamish and unwell. And that's what a sugary drink does. And I think that's like
exactly.
sugary words achieve exactly the same end.
Exactly. And people can see through it easily.
Totally.
Uh, so I guess I have one finishing question for you today, which is what
What's
advice
the
would you
capital of Paraguay?
give? Do we have an answer? Do we know?
Asuncion.
Ah, there you go. That's it. That's it. That's
Okay, brilliant.
yeah. Thanks,
Well, it's been
William.
lovely chatting to you, Libby. I really enjoyed this, actually. Glad we ended with the geography pop quiz. Sorry, I
Um,
very rudely interrupted you.
no, not at all. Um, yes. So my last question was, what advice would you give to the next generation of law firm leaders that'll follow in your footsteps, in protecting the culture that just say you've built upon?
Well, I think that this is a very ironic piece of advice coming from me, but listen more than you talk. And of course, people hear me talking all the time, but that's just one side of the coin. I spend most of my time in meetings, listening, observing, and spending time with people. And you cannot underestimate the power of spending time with people. Don't spend time just with the partners. Absolutely spend time with them, but spend more time with secretaries, with paralegals, with the post room, with the clerks, with the finance team, with HR, with like those are marketing, just in case people start going, why are we not getting a name check? But those are the people who will give you the lifeblood of what is going on in any office. And my old firm, I used to spend a disproportionate amount of time in the post room because they were really good laugh. They talked about, because this was in Cayman, and they talked about cricket, talked about, music and so on. I was like, this is brilliant, but I also got to understand so many things of what was important to them in an office. And this is when, I was an associate. And I was not spending any time there to try and get the inside line on the rhythm of that business. I was doing it because I was, I'm much happier talking about cricket and music than I was law. So, but that's where you learn things, and you don't learn things just hanging out with your contemporaries.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really great piece of advice. And as you say, the best experience that you had was working as a maitre d' in Chicago, for example, which I didn't see coming. I'm not going to lie. So there you go. Maybe on the next podcast we could delve into that.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I'm quite intrigued about how you ended up in Chicago. Yeah, I need to know a bit more, I think.
Yeah, leave it on that cliffhanger, and we can do this as a part series.
Yeah, a bit of an EastEnders moment there. Leave it there. But yeah, I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure to hear sort of your take on law firm culture, how you implement it yourself, and where you think you can maybe even do better. I think it's been great, and I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Olivia, it's easily the best podcast I've ever done. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I don't know about that, but I'll definitely take it, William. I will be searching every single podcast you've ever been on now, and measuring, to see, drats, they did a better question than me, or they told a better joke. So, but no, it's, as I say, it's been an absolute pleasure. So I really appreciate you coming on. I've been very excited about it for quite a while. So thank you.
Excellent. Well, look, thanks very much. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for asking such thoughtful questions.
You've been listening to Counsel Culture, the Business of Law podcast brought to you by Byfield. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and join us again next week, where we'll be discussing some more of the biggest stories in the legal sector.